We're in the old city of Jerusalem on the Via Dolorosa, the Way of the Cross. Pilgrims come here from all over the world to walk these streets as they commemorate Jesus' journey with his cross going to Calvary. We're standing at the place where pilgrims stop for the fourth station of the cross. Jesus meets his mother. From here, the pilgrims will continue to wind through the city's narrow streets as they go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Jesus died and rose from the dead. And this is a good place for us to begin our biblical journey as we walk with Jesus and Mary on the way to the cross. Right behind me, we can see through that window the rocks at the base of Golgotha. We're so close to the very place that Jesus died. And it was here that Jesus spoke his last words to his mother, Mary, that are recorded in Scripture. What are those words? In John chapter 19, verse 26, it says, "When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing near, he said to his mother, 'Woman, behold your son.' And then he said to the disciple, 'Behold your mother.'" What do these words mean? On one hand, these are very touching words. Jesus here taking care of his mother. One of the last acts he does before he dies is to think of his mother and entrust his mother into the care of his beloved disciple, St. John. But is there something more to this? Is there any deeper meaning that we can draw out of this? If you look at the passage in John chapter 19, John's account of Jesus at Calvary, it is packed with many allusions to the Old Testament and to various prophecies. There's a lot of theological symbolism all around here. That might lead us to suspect that there's a little more going on when Jesus says to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." What are some of these other things we see in John's Gospel? Just a few details. For example, in John chapter 19, verse 23, it happens to mention about how the soldiers took the garments from Jesus, and then it goes on and says that they cast lots for them in verse 24. Now, why do we need that detail? Because John is highlighting that this is an allusion to Psalm 22, which spoke about a man, a righteous man, who was being persecuted, suffering, he was being mocked, and for his garments they cast lots. John makes a similar point when he mentions that Jesus' body, when it's taken down from the cross, in verse 33, the soldiers didn't break his legs, which was the normal custom when they would take a body down from a crucifixion. But they didn't do that for Jesus. Why does John highlight that for us? Because he's trying to make a connection to Exodus 12:46, a text that describes how the Passover lamb was supposed to be an unblemished lamb whose legs were not broken. John's noting for us subtly that Jesus is the new Passover lamb being sacrificed for us on the Calvary. He's like those lambs of old whose legs weren't broken. And similarly, John mentions that in verse 34, the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear. Why do we get that information? Because he's trying to make an allusion to Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, about the man who will be looked upon, the one who was pierced. Jesus is the fulfillment of Zechariah 12:10 as he's pierced on his side, his body's pierced when they take him down from the cross. Now, all of this, and these are just a few examples of many allusions all throughout this passage. When we come to John 19, verses 25 through 27, and we read about Jesus and Mary and the beloved disciple at the cross, it would lead us to suspect that John has something more in mind than simply showing Jesus' love and care for his mother before he dies. What is that something more? I think the key is to see how John's gospel portrays the beloved disciple. John's gospel typically uses individual characters to represent a larger group of people. For example, if you read in John chapter 3, we read about a man named Nicodemus. Nicodemus is an individual Pharisee who's coming to Jesus at night. He's confused. He doesn't understand what Jesus is talking about. And we see in John's gospel, Nicodemus, the individual, is a character who represents the larger group of Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, particularly the Pharisees, who are in the dark. They don't understand Jesus. They're confused. So an individual representing a larger group. Similarly, in John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman comes to Jesus, and she's someone who's lived a sinful life, and she doesn't know the Messiah, but through her conversation with Christ, she comes to a conversion. She comes to believe in Jesus, and she goes and tells all the other Samaritans in the village about him. And that individual Samaritan woman at the well symbolizes the larger group of Samaritans who don't know the Messiah, who are estranged from the full faith of the Jewish religion. They are going to come to hear about Christ, and they're going to have a conversion, as we see at the end of that scene in John chapter 4, where they proclaim him as the Savior of the world. So this is how John's gospel works, with individuals representing larger groups, and we see this especially with the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple is traditionally understood to be St. John, the apostle that was closest to Jesus. But this beloved disciple represents a larger group of people, all faithful disciples. In fact, John's gospel portrays the beloved disciple in chapter 13 as the one who's close to Jesus at the Last Supper, leaning close to him. We see him as the only apostle who remains faithful to Jesus all the way up to Calvary. Everyone else scattered, they ran away in fear, but John, the beloved disciple, was the one who remained with Jesus at his dying moments. John is also the one who's the first to believe in the resurrection, as we see in John chapter 20, verse 8. And then chapter 21 goes on to show how the beloved disciple is the one who's the first to proclaim the risen Christ and bear witness to him. So we see this beloved disciple is closest to Jesus, faithful in times of persecution, faithful all the way to the cross, the first to believe. He's the first to bear witness to the risen Christ. He stands as the model, faithful disciple, like the Blessed Virgin Mary does in Luke's Gospel. And so when we look at the beloved disciple as representing all faithful disciples, think about what that might mean for our understanding of what Jesus says right before he dies, when he says to the beloved disciple, "Behold your mother. Behold your mother." Certainly, Mary is being entrusted into a spiritual, maternal relationship with St. John, the individual beloved disciple. But if John himself represents all of us, all faithful Christians, all faithful disciples of Christ, that is telling us that Jesus is entrusting Mary to be our spiritual mother. Mary is the mother of the individual disciple John in a spiritual sense, But because he represents all faithful disciples, we can see in John 19 that Mary is the spiritual mother of all faithful Christians, all beloved disciples, whom the beloved disciple represents. There's another theme we can consider here in John 19, and that is the theme of the hour. The climax of this theme is here at the cross. This theme of the hour we touched upon when we looked at Mary at Cana, when Jesus said to Mary there, "My hour has not yet come." And that's the beginning of this theme that runs all throughout the Gospel of John. Many times we read about this hour that has not come, this hour that's coming, it's almost here. In John chapter 7, verse 30, in John chapter 8, verse 20, people try to arrest Jesus, but Jesus escapes. They don't arrest him, and the text tells us why? Because his hour has not yet come. So as readers, we're wondering, when will this hour arrive? And finally, we get to John chapter 12. And in verse 23, Jesus finally says, "The hour has come. And the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." And this is a reference to Jesus' glory being made manifest on the cross. Jesus speaks those words when he enters into Jerusalem just a few days before he dies. And in John chapter 12, verse 31, he goes on to describe this hour as the time when the Son of Man will be lifted up from the earth. That's a reference to him being lifted up. He's going to be lifted up on the cross. And at that moment, he's going to draw all men to himself. And it's at that moment that Jesus says in 12:31 that the ruler of this world, the prince of this world, will be cast down. So what is the hour all about? The hour of John's gospel, the hour of Jesus, is the hour of his passion and death. And that's the hour when the prince of this world will be cast down. And who's the prince of this world? Satan, the deceiver. And in John's gospel, we've seen how the Satan, the serpent, being defeated is associated with that first prophecy of the Old Testament about the Messiah, Genesis 3:15, that prophecy that foretold that the woman of Genesis would have an offspring, an heir, who would crush the head of the serpent. That prophecy is now coming to fulfillment here at the cross, here at Golgotha, with Jesus dying. And right before he dies, he turns to his mother, and what does he call her? Woman again. There we see that title again, given to the Blessed Virgin Mary, woman. And in light of the theme of the hour when the Son of Man crushes the head of the serpent, when we can see deeper meaning in Jesus addressing his mother as woman. He's giving her an exalted title. She is that woman of Genesis. She is the new Eve. She's the woman whose son crushes the head of the serpent. How fitting it is that mother and son were right here at Calvary together at that moment when Genesis 3:15 was fulfilled. One last point that we can take away from this comes at the very end of this scene with Jesus and Mary in verse 27. It says, "And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home." Now, many of us, when we read this verse 27, we just think the beloved disciple here at the end of Good Friday takes Mary to his house, and that certainly happened. But there's something more, I would suggest, that's happening in this scene. John's Gospel is trying to highlight a beautiful relationship between Mary and the beloved disciple. A couple things to point out here is, first of all, the language of took. When it says that from that hour the disciple took her into his home. The language of took, there's this language of taking. The Greek word there can be used to describe moving a physical object. If it's a reference to an object, like Jesus in chapter 6 of John's Gospel takes bread. So he takes the bread. But when this word is used in relation to a person, it takes on a deeper, richer meaning. The word take is sometimes used in John's Gospel to describe someone welcoming Christ, receiving him. So in the prologue of John's Gospel in chapter 1, it refers to people taking Jesus in the sense of believing in his name, welcoming Jesus into their lives. Jesus also says in chapter 12 that whoever receives one that he sends receives him. So the idea of taking, it's actually the word, it's the same word. It takes on a connotation of receiving someone, welcoming someone. And so some scholars suggest that this word here about the beloved disciple taking Mary into his own is the idea of welcoming Mary, receiving Mary into his life. And then when it says, my translation in the Revised Standard Version says that the beloved disciple took her into his own home. The language in Greek could more literally be translated, take her into his own. In other words, taking Mary into his own interior life. And so here we can consider how the beloved disciple, the model disciple, takes Mary into his own spiritual life, welcoming her as his spiritual mother. And that's a great lesson for us, that we, faithful followers of Christ, if we want to walk in the footsteps of the beloved disciple, we too should take Mary into our own, welcoming her spiritual motherhood as a great gift, receiving this beautiful gift that Jesus gave us right here at Calvary. We're standing at the foot of Calvary, and behind me is the place traditionally believed to be where Jesus' body was anointed for his burial. What was Mary going through in these painful moments on Good Friday? The Bible actually doesn't tell us much. Much of Christian art and literature, prayers and hymns reflect on this moment in Mary's life, but the scriptures themselves don't report Mary saying a single word, and the only detail we get about what Mary was doing at the cross is this. It says that Mary was standing by the cross of Jesus. Standing by the cross of Jesus. What does that mean in John's Gospel? Well, we know this theme from earlier in the Synoptic Gospels in Jesus' public ministry of discipleship being associated with taking up the cross and following Jesus. In fact, that's what Jesus says. If you want to be my disciple, pick up your cross and follow me. But very few people will pick up their cross and follow Jesus all the way to the cross itself. All of the apostles, all of them except St. John, the beloved disciple, abandoned Jesus on that day. But Mary is standing by the cross of Jesus. She's one of the few that follow him all the way to Calvary. It's interesting when another apostle, Peter, for example, is described in these moments as standing. In the Passion narrative of John's Gospel, he's standing outside the high priest's house, or he's standing by the fire, warming himself when he denies Christ. Mary, however, is portrayed as standing at the cross of Jesus. She is faithful. Now, one thing that I think is interesting to turn to is a passage earlier in John's Gospel that took place during the Last Supper, when Jesus tells a story, a mini parable, about what's going to happen on Good Friday and Easter Sunday. He uses the image of childbirth to describe the kind of painful suffering the apostles are going to go through when they see him betrayed and go on trial and be condemned and then have to be scourged and crucified on Calvary. In John chapter 16, verse 20, Jesus is speaking to his disciples just before he begins his passion. And he says to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. When a woman is in travail, she has sorrow, because her hour has come. But when she is delivered of the child, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a child is born into the